Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The main focus will be Ocheretyne. It has been reported that the Russians have fully captured the village. The reports sound as such. The Russians have managed to capture the center of Ocheretyne, and they have managed to push the Ukrainians out of the village to the outskirts. These are likely by the fortifications that the Ukrainians have at the outskirts of the village. This means that the Ukrainians are right now reorganizing in the outskirts of the village, outside of the village, preparing until the night, where they then prepare a counterattack to try and regain positions and regain their foothold within Ocheretyne, and even an attempt to push the Russians completely out of the village. Following the current developments, the Russians now have control over Ocheretyne, but the Ukrainians are preparing a massive counterattack with the 47th Mechanized Brigade. The Russians have so far managed to capture the village of Ocheretyne in just 4 days, from gaining a foothold within the fortifications, and the village itself to fully gaining control over the village. This happening in just 4 days despite the fortifications built around Ocheretyne and the heavy defenses concentrated in the area, and the 47th Mechanized Brigade arriving to plug the gap is an astonishing fact. Based on the satellite imagery we have of the area from today, it is clear that the artillery and FAB bombs being used by the Russians is a deciding factor for the success of the Russians, as they've managed to heavily bombard all of these fortified positions of the Ukrainians, forcing them to withdraw out of the village, and the Russians gaining easy control of it with their assault groups due to the Ukrainians simply being unable to hold their lines due to the heavy bombardment. It does not help that the Ukrainians lack the capabilities to respond to these bombardments due to the lack of ammunition. This is why the further aid to Ukraine is so critical. But even so, the Russians have had this much of a significant firepower advantage since the start of the war. It has just increased recently from 5-1 to 10-1. The main impact that is allowing the Russians to successfully gain control over these villages is how the army itself has developed, both in number and in quality, as it now allows the Russians to have a lot of experience from the fighting that they have taken place in both of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, allowing them to now have much experience storming cities and villages, now allowing them to make use of that experience to gain control of important villages such as Ocheretyne. And the importance of Ocheretyne is shown in these images here. The first one shows the heights that is centered around Ocheretyne itself. We see that the Ocheretyne is placed on the high grounds. The villages to the southwest of Ocheretyne are all located in the low ground from Ocheretyne, and in the northern and eastern directions, the Russians also have access to the high grounds after the capture of Ocheretyne. This will allow for a Russian bloom following the capture of Ocheretyne, as they would launch assaults in every direction. Taking a look at the location of Ocheretyne from Russian control and Ukrainian positions, we see to the south there's the villages of Novobakhmutivka and Solovyove. In the northern direction there's Akhanhelske. In the eastern direction there's Novokalinovo and Keramik, which is now isolated from its supply lines as well. If we take a look to the southwest, there's Sokil and Vokshut, other areas here to the southwest. There's the railway in the northwestern direction. In every direction, the Russians can advance towards Ukrainian positions with an advantageous position. If we take a look at the fortifications, there is some locations such as by Sokil where there are fortifications directly towards Ocheretyne and this massive fortified area north of the village in the heights overlooking it. However, we do also know that with the FAB bombs and the fortifications being concentrated in one area, it will not be much of a threat to the Russian Air Force and subsequently the Russian assault groups launching assaults towards those positions. These Ukrainian fortifications were very useful as long as the Ukrainians had a working air defense, but now the Russian Air Force is allowed to freely bombard these positions due to the development of the FAB bombs and the mass production of them. This has allowed the Russians to launch hundreds of FAB bombs every day, and at such a rate, it is very devastating to the Ukrainian armed forces and their defensive capabilities. The speed of the Russian advances and capture of Ocheretyne also indicates the proximity to the upcoming Kharkiv offensive. This is due to the fact that in and along the Russian Kharkiv offensive, it is likely that the Ukrainians will be forced to withdraw a lot of troops from the front to deal with that Russian offensive in the north. This will significantly weaken the Ukrainian lines in the east and in the south, which is perfect time for the Russians to then launch a subsequent invasion and offensive from the south and from the east. The objective would be to gain full control over the Donetsk region, the Zaporizhia region, and in the Kharkiv region as well. This would allow the Russians to then creep in on Dnipro from 3 separate directions, from the north in the direction of Kharkiv, from the east in the direction of Donetsk, and from the south in the direction of Zaporizhia, after which they would look to cross over the Dnieper River. This will be their long-term plan, but the objective now would be Kharkiv, which is evidently very clear for either a massive offensive or a small offensive. Either way, something is definitely coming in the direction of Kharkiv. There is a lot of the indications of this, and I'll provide those as follow. Reason number 1. The Russians have continuously bombarded Kharkiv for a very long time. For many months, the Russians have constantly launched FAB bombs not just towards Kharkiv, but against Sumy as well. This has created massive power outages with the strategic strikes towards Kharkiv, but also a lot of strikes on Ukrainian air defense positions, as well as army concentrations and military objectives within the city of Kharkiv. This has continued for many months now. The second reason is the recent destruction of the Kharkiv communication tower, pretty much destroying the internet connection and television broadcasting in the area. The third one is the fact that the Russians have created an Army Group North. This Army Group North would be dedicated to this Kharkiv-Sumy area. The leader of said Army Group North is General Alexander Lepin. He was also the former Army Group leader that previously attacked Kharkiv and Sumy at the start of the Russian invasion. Everything indicates that a massive assault is coming towards Kharkiv. Likely also Sumy could be involved in this assault, and the Russians is definitely looking to gain full control over Kharkiv in such an offensive. This offensive has likely been split up to the fifth reason, which is the Ukrainian aid package coming from the United States. The Russians will likely look to take advantage of the current situation prior to additional aid being sent to Ukraine by launching said offensive. The only demerit to such an offensive for the Russians right now is the fact that the weather conditions are not optimal, so it is likely that they may delay it continuously until the weather conditions improve. However, the fact that the United States aid package has been confirmed to Ukraine means that it is very likely that the Russians will simply speed up the process and attack Kharkiv prior to the weather improving to gain the advantage of the United States aid not arriving, because the biggest points to the United States aid package are 2 points. The first one is air defense for the Ukrainians, and the second one is artillery ammunition and systems for the Ukrainians, which the Ukrainians are significantly short on right now. An extra point to the communications tower that was hit in Kharkiv is that the Ukrainians had installed communication systems on the communications tower. The fact that it has been destroyed by the Russians means that the air defense of Ukrainian armed forces in the Kharkiv region has suffered a severe communications hit, which makes it difficult for them to operate. The exact details I'm not sure of, but this means that the Russian operations towards Kharkiv are very close. The final reason as to the Russian Kharkiv offensive happening and being very close is that the Russians are now in a position where they have started removing mines from the border, from the Russian side of the border. And this is a clear indication that the Russians are going to launch an offensive operation towards Kharkiv. The exact details of such an Kharkiv offensive I've mentioned in a previous video, but I'll make an additional video to talk in detail about what I expect from this upcoming Kharkiv offensive, which I expect to be very soon. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content, and thank you all for watching and have a great day.